All right. Looks pretty mixed. Lots of rivers. What about swimming pools? Fair enough. I was thinking more natural water, but I am a river person as well, like everybody else here. All right. So, all right. What are we doing today? Okay. First period. Ugh, getting getting centered here. All right. So, we're going to start with an opener. And you're going to do an SAQ, and I'll show it to you. I linked it as a Google Doc because it was kind of too big to put in the, I'll link it into the chat, but it felt like it was too big to put in the slides. Let me link it into the chat here. But you're reading right now in the notes about the Roaring Twenties. We have talked so far a lot about, well, not a lot, but we have talked about that the push for temperance and prohibition. We talked about World War One. So we're going to kind of combine those by looking at this SAQ. I'll open it up so everybody can see it on the screen, I guess. In your opener today, doesn't have to be super, I'm not looking for like full complete sentences because it's just an opener. But remember, I want to keep practicing, make sure that we keep keep practicing with SAQs that have the political cartoon or a primary source instead of just the ones we did first quarter that was just a straight up question or the two historians' point of views. So you have this propaganda, and it says, "Will you back me or back booze? Vote yes for prohibition on November 5th." So, and it's the Ohio Dry Federation. So, unconditional surrender. Will you join in this demand?
But weren't there a lot of like military people that also drank booze?
Well,
Like,
sure. But it wasn't so much, I mean, that's part of what you kind of have to think about when you're answering this question. I think the book talked about the role of prohibition and how it relates to World War One. I'm pretty sure it did. I can look too and see if I can give you a page reference number too. Um, I don't want to just give it away by just describing it. Okay, let me see if I can find it. Um, does it talk about it in here? Maybe not. Let me see real quick. Yeah, that's where it is, but I'm trying to find if they wrote about the connection to World War One. Is it? Oh, yeah, yeah, it says it in that first couple sentences. So it actually, you guys might not have actually gotten to it. I thought for some reason it was in the World War One section. Um, so, well, you can still do it. So, if you look at page 506 in AMSCO, that first, yeah, I'll just kind of, you know what, I'm just going to kind of explain it a little bit. You can reference it on page 506 and I'll kind of explain it. And then I want you to just like formulate a response for A and B, even though I'm kind of giving you the answer. It'll still be good practice for you to be able to analyze this picture specifically. And then I'm going to steal some responses and go over them tomorrow. Um, so remember that during World War One, and this is true for World War II as well, is that these are like full society mobilizations for war. It's not like war that's fought in your lifetime today, where you're really have you ever been asked to sacrifice for a war effort on the part of the country? No, never. You never have. But with World War One and with World War Two, everybody was responsible for conserving consumption of resources so that as much resources as possible could be sent to the troops. Does that make sense to everybody? Um, and in the case of prohibition, we know that the push for prohibition and temperance was already happening by a bunch of progressive groups. So you could definitely use some examples of different groups and different prohibition groups who are pushing for prohibition. But World War One played a role too in kind of like pushing that last step to actually get it as an amendment to the Constitution. Because what does anybody know what alcohol is made of? Yeah, grains. And what can grains also be used as? Food, right? So part of the push to end the consumption of and production of alcohol was that instead of making booze, which is a lot of prohibitionists argued was bad for society, we could be using those grains to actually feed troops that are fighting this war. Does that make sense to everybody? So see if you can kind of connect that in your own wording to this image. Okay, so that's part A. And then B, give one specific historical development or circumstance. So that can be a law, it can be a group, it can be any type of like vocab word basically. That led to these changes that led to prohibition, okay? Um and you can just kind of you don't have to word it in a perfect SAQ response. You can kind of word it in just like a simple sentence instead of doing like the full complete response.
So we
Um
don't make a like a copy of it? Do we write it on the
no,
like
this is in your
openers?
opener. Yep.
Okay.
Yep, you're responding to it in your opener. Okay. So I'll give you all, oh gosh, this shouldn't take, I just kind of explained a lot of the responses, but you might want to look up something from that we talked about in the progressive era. So like on Monday and Tuesday, or something that we talked about, or something that you're reading in on page 506 in AMSCO where it talks about prohibition. All right. And I'll give you about 6-ish minutes. Just a couple more minutes. Does anybody need more time? No? Okay, so this is what we're gonna do. Um, for part A, um, I don't think we're gonna really go over it too much, except to say that um, when you do describe one perspective about alcohol use during the 1920s expressed through the image, you have to make sure that you are connecting it to the image. Like this one is clearly talking about World War One. If this were the AP exam in May and you saw this visual and you said, you just started talking about prohibition and how there were lots of people in the progressive era who wanted to ban alcohol, but didn't specifically reference some connection to World War One, you probably wouldn't get credit for part A. Okay. So whenever it asks you, whenever it says, whenever you get a political cartoon, it'll almost always use this phrase expressed through the image. And you really do, it doesn't mean like every single little piece of the image, because some pictures are like really layered and have a lot going on, have like are making multiple points with multiple like visuals. So you don't have to like necessarily address all of them. But this one's kind of an obvious. So you would say something like, um, you would say you're basically just describing the point of view of the picture. So you just say something like, um, during World War One, people were being asked to support banning alcohol in order to support giving resources to the troops. And you don't even have to know that outside information. You can get A correct without really knowing anything besides what you see in the picture. So you could just say, you could literally have just said, the government wants, the government of Ohio wanted Americans to support banning alcohol um, as a way to ensure that there was support for the troops. It's really simple. Okay. So you're just essentially summarizing the point of view of the picture. Everybody good? Yay? Okay. Um, or that it's patriotic. You could have even said that. That it's supporting that governments were arguing that it was supportive of the country and patriotic to ban alcohol because it would be better for the troops or something like that. For B, this is what I want to see in the chat. Everybody get ready. Don't hit don't hit return yet, okay? I'm going to give you a second here. Everybody in the chat, I just want you to write the one thing that was your historical example that you used. You don't have to explain it or describe it, but what did you say was a historical example that could be used? Don't hit enter yet because I want you all to do it at the same time. so that everybody doesn't just copy the first person who writes, okay? So type it into the chat right now, and I'll tell you when to hit enter. Type it in. What's the one specific example you use to support part B? Because there's like of what things that we've learned in the progressive era, and if you read into the Roaring Twenties, you could have written about like 20 different things. So, all right, ready, set, now. Everybody hit enter. Good job. Thank you, everybody, for doing that. Those of you who didn't do it immediately, what you doing? Okay. Volstead Act work, 18th Amendment, definitely Volstead Act, 18th Amendment. Those are kind of obvious ones, right? Um, Angels mentioned World War I resources, definitely. Even though, by the way, this you because I think a lot of people would have felt like that would be double dipping because you're already talking about World War I with the cartoon. But if you didn't actually explain in part A, if you didn't explain how like it was really important to get resources like grains to feed the troops, then you could definitely use that as part B. Temperance, you could talk about previous temperance acts. You could have talked about dry and wet laws. Yes, you could have talked about recession. Prohibition reforms, yeah, but you got to be a little bit more specific. Okay. 18th Amendment. Um, yep. So 19th Amendment, the right to vote for women. I will say that you could have written about how women were the biggest force behind pushing for prohibition. Everybody good? You could have used women. You could have used, nobody said anything about like the American Temperance Society. There was all sorts of, you could have written about any of the organizations that fought for that stuff. Um, yeah, you couldn't use the 21st because that's after the time period. But I'm really glad you said that because that's one annoying thing is that they are pretty picky about making sure it's within the dates. And I said you don't have to know dates. And usually it's pretty it's pretty easy to get it in the dates, but I would guess that probably if this were like a real one on the national exam, I would guess that quite a few people would put the 21st Amendment because it's hard to remember that that was just a few years after. But we haven't actually learned about it yet. But I will pretty heavily emphasize that that happened during the Great Depression and not during the Roaring Twenties. So, which I haven't taught you yet. Thank you guys. That was you guys had good ideas, and I appreciate that chat storm there. All right, so here's what we're going to do for the rest of the period. I want to do a really short reference to, um, I want to do a really short reference to your DBQ practice that we started the other day. We're not gonna like actually do that DBQ. We're not gonna like, um, we're not gonna do any like big thing with it. Um, so um, but I do want to show you real quick. Just lost my spot. Hold on. Where'd you go? We're going to do that real quick. I'm just going to show you real quick how you would continue to use that. Okay, here we go. So if you remember, so we'll get into the Roaring Twenties here in a second. But I just want to kind of, because we are going to start working with a practice DBQ first thing next week. Um, and so I want to review the process now because we have obviously every day we have like such limited time. And I want to talk about this process because I don't want to have to repeat it next week. I want you to all like know how the just the first step, which is just brainstorming the documents in the DBQ. I want you all to remember how that works. Okay. So I had in here a DBQ for you. It had 5 documents, right? The prompt said, evaluate the extent to which just means how much did the progressive era foster change in American society between 1900 and 1920? When it says, to what extent did it foster change? All it means is, did it change things or did things mostly stay the same? And when you get a prompt like that, you can almost always argue either way. You can say things stayed the same or you can say things mostly changed. It also is nice because it gives you an opening for a counterpoint. You can say, well, things mostly changed. However, blah, blah, blah did stay the same, or things mostly stayed the same. However, there were some small changes. So it's giving you a chance to have like a dominant argument paragraph or 2 paragraphs, and then have a counterpoint at the end. Because I've talked about this a million times. The AP exam people, they love gray areas. Like they love complexity. They want to see, it's really not about, honestly, how like hardcore you argue your point. That's not really they're not looking for some like beautifully constructed, like really well defended argument. They are looking for you to defend your main point of view, but they're really looking for you to show that you understand how complex this time period is and that you can see like all the sides of it. Okay. So your job is to read that prompt and then brainstorm the documents. This is what your brainstorm might have looked like. Okay, so I don't know. I've looked at a couple people's, but I haven't really looked through everybody's. But this is what it might have looked like. Okay, so the first document showed a political cartoon. It really was just showing Teddy is like a trust buster, basically, right? He's like prosecuting and controlling um, these trusts. Okay, the second one was about how gross the meat industry was. Third, it's talking about how Wilson was removing African Americans from office, from federal positions. Um, the fourth was the Clayton Antitrust Act, and it was the actual act. I know what that is. If you didn't remember what that was about, you could have put like a little bit of like a dash and then a quick, like, 4-word description of what is in that act. If you know what it is or know the basic idea, then you don't have to do that, right? Because it's all about this brainstorm is all about you. It's not for me, it's for you. And the last one is a woman protester show that saying that she wants more rights. Okay. So then what do? After you do a quick brainstorm of the document, and maybe there's one you didn't understand. Like maybe you didn't understand document 5. And don't tune out right now. Because I know your cameras are off and I've been pretty lenient about it, but don't just tune out because you're gonna need this information when we start this DBQ, okay? Or the next DBQ practice. So maybe you looked at this and you're like, Kaiser Wilson, and you're reading this and you're like, I don't even understand what this poster is. Then what you should do is write what you do see. Women protesters, something, Kaiser Wilson. Maybe you're just like writing something you saw, but you were confused. Put in a bunch of question marks. Because this will tell you, like, it'll give you a little description so you kind of remember what it is. But then you're telling yourself here, like, I wasn't really totally sure what that was about. So then you come down here. We don't write the thesis statement yet. The reason we do this super quick, like very short little brainstorm is because you get a sense of what kind of documents you're working with. And it's easier to kind of picture that and almost like puzzle pieces, figure out where they could fit and how you could group them together to write a thesis statement. Because your thesis statement really shouldn't be like calling out individual documents. Like your thesis statement shouldn't be, although meat industry was bad or was a big change, treatment of African Americans was an example of staying the same. You shouldn't just do like 2 single documents like that. you should at least have one kind of larger category that you can group multiple documents under. Okay. So you might look at this and you might say, well, goodness, okay, so I see that Teddy trust busting, the Antitrust Act, and like changes to the meat industry. Those three actually kind of go together, right? As just like a big trust busting change, right? So I might put one, three, or one, two, and four. And then three and four and five, and maybe you don't really understand five. And so you're like, well, maybe I could fit five with three if I look at it again and see if I can connect it. But I do know three is definitely a criticism that the progressive era was definitely had some continuities for African Americans who were experiencing more discrimination in the federal government than they were before, right? So you might say discrimination, continuity. Make sure that you're calling out in your brainstorm whether you're arguing change or continuity. And so I'm going to put three and then maybe five question mark. And that might tell me like I'll go back and look at five and maybe I can swing five in if I reread it and I can think maybe it fits in there. So now I know that like I have three documents I feel pretty good about as a category of just like, big business was like busted up as a big change. And then one document, maybe two, for things staying the same with like discrimination. So obviously, then I'm going to argue that things changed, right? And this is going to be my dominant argument. And I might have one big paragraph and try to weave in all three. Or maybe I break these two up into two dominant paragraphs. And then I have one smaller paragraph that's talking about the counterpoint, that things did sort of also stay the same. Does that make sense to everybody? And I'm just going to show you like a really short, we'll do thesis statements. So that's it. I'm not going to go over again the value of brainstorming or why you're doing this or how you're organizing the documents. Anybody have any questions about just that first process and why you do it and what it should look like? Any questions? There's no stupid question, you guys. If you're thinking it, somebody else is too. Yeah. Yeah. It depends. I would say probably you don't have to have a conclusion, but it's nice to we talked about this in quarter one. The conclusion is nice to have as like a sweep up paragraph. Like once you finish writing it, your essay, sometimes it's nice to have a conclusion because you can kind of clean up some of the points you made earlier, but you're going to rephrase them better. Like maybe now that you finished the essay, you're like, my thesis at the beginning was kind of a little messy. I'm going to clarify it in the conclusion. You can do that, right? Um, so, or if you finish the essay and you just have time to spare, just start writing stuff. Like just start writing stuff about the time period because maybe it'll help you get the context point. I'll go over the whole like what points there are, but the conclusion is a nice cleanup space, but it's not required. So really you're looking at you have to have an introduction because you do need a thesis statement in there. And we usually try to do context in there too. And then I would say two or three body paragraphs. Usually either one big one with your dominant paragraph, with your dominant argument, or two smaller ones with your dominant argument, and then one with your counterpoint. That's usually so introduction with a thesis, and then two or three body paragraphs. And when we go over writing this essay, I'm going to go over, which will probably start a little bit tomorrow and continue next week. I'm going to go over the rubric again so you see what points are there. I'll show you paragraph structures. I'll show you an example. But for right now, I just want you to remember like, what do you just do when you get a DBQ? Like, what's step one? And step one is just making sure you understand what the prompt is asking you to do and then doing a quick brainstorm of some documents. Okay. And then thinking about how they might work together. Because this is what's going to help you write your thesis statement. If all you're doing is just like looking at all these documents, it's just like overwhelming, right? And you're not sure how you pair them together because there's just like so much going on. But if you put it in a nice, simple, and that's why I also don't want you to write like big, long sentences in your brainstorm, because I want you to just see the basic idea so that you get an easy, simple way to look about how you might, puzzle piece organize this. Because when you go to write your essay, you'll go when you're ready to use document 1 in your essay, you'll go back to document 1. They don't just disappear, right? You can come back here and look at it again and make sure that however you summarize it or use it, that you're using it correctly, right? Because they're not going away. So the point of this is just a real quick, how am I going to organize this thing so that I know how to get started? Okay. Sound good to everybody? Any more questions just about that first process? Okay, cool. So before I get into the lecture here, which um, we don't have a ton of time left, and I kind of want to, before I jump too far into our lecture. Now remember the Roaring Twenties notes, I changed the due date. They are due tonight. Okay. I am posting the lecture notes now, but they're not organized exactly by your book. Okay, so I am expecting you to read the book. This is more of a I've organized this more in kind of more categories that are simplified. Excuse me. So I'll go over most of this tomorrow, and tomorrow we're going to do our kind of activity for the day, which we'll probably do in the opener, but it'll be a longer extended opener. We're going to do some stuff with the Harlem Renaissance, which is, I think you guys will really, really like. So we're kind of crunched for time, but I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to just show you like 5 minutes of a video. It's the same, sort of stop share. It's the same video series that we watched with that World War One video. And I'm just gonna have you, I want you to just get a vibe for the Roaring Twenties. And it has really good, hold on, skip ad. It just has really good live footage. That's why I like about it is it's not like a recreation. It's like real footage from the time period. So let me just do this. Sorry guys. So I'll do that for 5 minutes or so and just let you watch a little bit of it. And I'll link it in the slides too. So if you want to watch more of it, you can. So we'll watch 5 or so minutes of it, and then I'll do some just a few slides in the PowerPoint, and then we'll be done for the day. Oop. Can you hear it? Probably not. I forgot to share sound. Too many things. Okay, here we go.
Throughout the 1920s, the nightlife here glittered. Bands played and liquor flowed. And everyone who was drinking it was breaking the law. In the first month of the new decade, the 18th Amendment became the law of the land. The sale and consumption of alcohol was now illegal.
There was prohibition, but oddly enough, nobody paid any attention to it.
You went to people's homes, they served dreadful things called orange blossoms, which was gin and orange juice. Revolting. And bad gin at that.
Liquor was now sold behind closed doors in places called speakeasies. Proprietors took the risks and reaped the profits.
It was good money in them days. I was 15 years old. I was riding around with a Nash convertible. We had 4 speakeasies. One by the Daily News, one by the Daily Mirror. You had a people, you let them in. Okay. A guy had to explain who he was, and he'd show you an ID or something, and you let him in. You got to know it was like family after a while.
Every corner had a saloon on it. Of course, they were never raided by The cops were a big part of that business, too. People wanted to drink. It was a great game.
It became a dangerous game for the high-stakes players. Battles between rival gangs for control of illegal liquor territories riddled American cities with mushrooming murder rates. Prohibition's aim was to sweep liquor off the city streets. Now they were flooded with gangsters and guns.
I used to carry 2 persuaders myself. You had to have them, or else.
They called a nickname for guns was persuaders.
Prohibition and the general disregard which followed it was the perfect symbol for the 20s, a decade which was about crossing the line, smashing tradition, breaking boundaries. As modern America came of age in the 1920s, boundaries of all sorts, technological, geographical, and social, were shattered. The roar in the Roaring Twenties was the birth scream of the modern. America was now about to leave behind the formative experience of its rural past and embrace the promise of an urban future. But progress would have its price. A sudden, wrenching departure from the certainties of the traditional and the familiar, spread by an emerging mass media, movies and the radio. Things that seem old and familiar now were just beginning to take shape in the 1920s. At the dawn of the 1920s, America was clearly entering a new era, an era defined by a vast and complicated urban culture that would dominate the rest of the 20th century. After World War I, there was an eagerness to embrace the new, and it was in America's cities, most dramatically in its biggest, New York, where the modern age was born. The very architecture of the city spoke of America's new ascendancy and her aspirations.
The skyscraper was an example of the new form achieving a kind of thrilling scale and nobility. More people worked there than lived in the average small town in America.
A movement to the cities that had started during World War I accelerated. In 1920, for the first time, more Americans lived in urban centers than in country towns and villages.
The pace is being set in the cities. The city is irresistibly attractive, is really at a kind of high tide in this decade. It's a force, a magnet.
The very names of New York streets would become synonymous with progress and innovation. Broadway would represent the best and latest in American entertainment.
So I'm going to stop it there. If we get a chance, we'll watch a little more tomorrow, but I just wanted you to
Madison Avenue would come to stand for the bustling new business.
Just get a vibe of the 20s there. So I'll just do a couple slides here and then let you go. And talk about just some of the themes. So the first, you have 2 topics of notes or sections in AMSCO. The first one is about just like technology and innovation, which most of the first of these slides do cover. So like, why was there a big boom in industry during this time period? World War I, and this is what like kind of I think it's important to understand this. Like, America really was, it was so important that America joined World War I and World War II, obviously. But that they could have had some pretty unfortunate endings for the world if America hadn't joined it. So does America deserve its like heroism? Absolutely. America lost tens of thousands of lives fighting the war and contributing resources to all the troops, for sure. But it wasn't without its benefits for the United States too. The war itself was fought in Europe, not in the United States. And you can't like overlook the destruction and devastation that happens when a war is in your country. Does that make sense? And if it's not, like, so the war ends, America certainly lost lives and had contributed tons of resources that wasn't without like sincere sacrifice. But we also emerged just like rocking because our economy was completely unscathed, right? Physically, everything was like not only intact and not destroyed because the war wasn't happening here, but also like revved to go because we had been like revving it to produce resources for the war, and now we're just shifting that to consumer resources, to consumer goods. And so, and a lot of the labor restrictions during World War II, telling labor unions they couldn't fight for more rights for their workers because they needed to work for the war effort, those kind of continued into the Roaring '20s, that vibe. And a lot of that stuff sort of increased the kind of consumerism and efficiency of factories during this time period. Lots of new innovations during this era, all sorts of like kind of stuff you think about like modern household type goods, and also big stuff like, I don't know, the automobile and the airplane. So lots of big transportation changes and entertainment, movies, baseball became like a popular sport. Um, this is the first time there were kind of like national heroes. That's a picture of Charles Lindbergh, who was probably the most famous celebrity during this time period. He was the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic in an airplane. He was also pretty terrible. He was anti-Semitic, meaning he was anti-Jewish, and actually leading up to World War II, he was trying to get America to not join the war because he sympathized with the Germans and what they were doing, which is not nice. But there's like this huge scandal that happened during the Roaring '20s because he was a super big celebrity. Horrible, sad story. Somebody kidnapped his baby and held the baby for ransom. And it was like, this was like the biggest news story of the decade, really. And the baby didn't make it, and really just terribly sad, horrible, sad story. But again, it kind of like showed the role of media. Like people wanted to read like scandals and about like people that they admired. Like this was a big boom in media in terms of like not just like reporting the news, but also a more like social media. um you know, if Instagram was a thing, was this is when Instagram would be a thing in old days, right? Kind of that social, more social vibe to reading news and things like that. Consumerism, again, more people were shopping in department stores, advertising for businesses increased, people were buying on credit. There was no such thing as credit cards, but you would have like department stores had a ledger and like would say how much you'd owe and you'd pay it back on certain with interest. Kind of like if you have a credit card for a specific store today, you know how some stores like offer credit cards for their store. You guys know what I'm talking about? um it's the same concept, but just they would have it on pencil and paper at stores, which meant people bought more. All right, I know I'm out of time, but we'll tomorrow. I'm gonna kind of. I think the automobile is kind of obvious, the like the big impacts, but obviously the automobile revolutionized not just society but economy as well. So I'm gonna kind of skip that. You can figure that out on your own. Tomorrow we're gonna hit all the social stuff. There were a lot of conflicts: the Red Scare, um, women's rights, the Scopes trial, which is a big religious kind of modern thinking, scientific thinking clash, the Harlem Renaissance and the Great Migration. And Prohibition, obviously. We're gonna do all that stuff tomorrow. So yeah, so you're free to go. Make sure you finish those notes. They're due tonight. And that's it. Anybody have any questions? Your applied learning is just finishing those notes, making sure you got them turned in. All right, have a good day, guys. We'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Thank you.
Bye.
You're welcome. Bye.